Andy Worthington in London, if I could start with you, sir, first. How realistic is the comparison between the detention centres at Bagram and Guantanamo Bay?
Well, you know, in one particular way, there's a great difference in that it's located in an active war zone. But having said that, the problem with Bagram is that it's not being run as though it's a proper prisoner of war camp in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and it never has been. And so in certain ways, holding people without any rights whatsoever is what happened both at Bagram and at Guantanamo. And Bagram is now a kind of version of Guantanamo as it was many years ago, because of course there have been so many legal challenges at Guantanamo that have established the rights for the prisoners to have habeas corpus petitions. Lawyers have been going to Guantanamo for nearly 5 years now, whereas at Bagram nobody outside the military, apart from representatives of the Red Cross, has ever set foot in the place. So it's a kind of how Guantanamo was many years ago, I think.
Well, with all the challenges taking place, and you mentioned a couple, what chance does the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, have of successfully suing the American government to have the public record, the records at Bagram made public?
I'm not sure what's going to happen about getting the names and nationalities of people. I mean, the interesting thing about what the court cases have been about the habeas corpus petitions at Bagram, what makes it so different from one part of the story is that it's a prison in an active war zone. So Afghans who are captured in Afghanistan should be treated as prisoners of war and held off the battlefield for the duration of hostilities. What these cases were focusing on is three of the, we're not sure how many, several dozen foreign prisoners who were rendered into Bagram and have been held there for up to 6 years, and who, as Judge Bates ruled back in March, are effectively the same as the prisoners in Guantanamo, except that they have no rights. And as I've said repeatedly, it only seems to be some kind of administrative error that prevented these men from being sent to Guantanamo, along with all the rest of the 779 men who ended up with these rights.
Right, let me bring in David Rifkin. Good to have you here, sir.
Pleasure.
In your opinion, what makes those at Bagram different from those held at Guantanamo?
Well, I agree with my colleague that the fact that it's an active war zone is a fundamental difference, because remember, while the Boumediene decision by the Supreme Court that established or applied habeas to Guantanamo was quite unprecedented, even revolutionary, at least some of us felt it was cabined, limited by its terms to one site, Guantanamo, both because of its unique character. You know, we argued that America didn't have formal sovereignty over Guantanamo, but clearly it is in a unique position there. And second, because frankly it was a very limited site in terms of the number of people there. If you're going to now extend the same philosophy to Bagram, where do you stop? And every detention facility in a war zone suddenly becomes supervised by the judiciary branch of our government, which is historically unprecedented, constitutionally unprecedented, and substantially impairs the war effort. So I would say, with respect to my colleague, yes, people have been detained there for years to come, but that is how things work in war. If you look at World War I or World War II or Civil War, any war in which the United States was involved, you never had habeas process extended to individuals captured in the context of that battle. And in terms of conditions of detainment, they're better than any, even though they're not entitled to full protections of Geneva Conventions as POWs, being unlawful combatants and whatnot. They're much better than conditions in any German or British or American prisoner war camp in World War I and World War II.
Let me ask you one thing, though, David. The Afghans have cited the Bagram facility as one of the main reasons that causes resent among Afghans against the coalition forces. So, in terms of improving the security situation, particularly the safety of the coalition forces there, isn't it important to deal with these kind of issues comprehensively?
It is important, and of course, General McChrystal is very keen to try to win the hearts and minds. But again, it's one of those things in life we have to do the balancing act. Yes, there are undoubtedly some Afghans who resent this, and there are some Afghans who resent any presence of foreign troops. On the other hand, many Afghans want more troops and want more security. You can't have it both ways. Look, one of the things that my problem with critics is they don't seem to acknowledge that their policy preferences have consequences. If you look at the record of the habeas proceedings in the District Court for the District of Columbia with regard to Guantanamo, the government has lost 98% of the cases, not really because these people are all innocent shepherds, because you just simply cannot gather the kind of evidence that you need to comply with very high evidentiary hurdles. If you're going to extend this regime to Bagram, everybody would be let go. And my colleague is right. Right now, Judge Bates chose, as a discretionary step, not because he felt bound by it legally, discretionary only to apply it to people captured outside of Afghanistan. But wait a minute. The new concept for warfare is to go into Pakistan and various other places to take the battle to the enemy instead of just letting them come into Afghanistan. So we filed a brief on behalf of a group of former special operations people who point out when you go out to do a snatch and grab mission, you are not going to be able to do a CSI Kandahar, you know, rolling in the dust trying to get the kind of forensic evidence that you need to hold them. So the practical consequence of giving them all habeas is they'll be by and large released. How are you supposed to win a war when you run a revolving door operation?
Let me get back to Andy Worthington in London. A viewer question, if I could put to you, that came in from Michigan in the USA, from Linda Taylor, who says, Bagram is probably the same as Gitmo, people picked up for being at the wrong place at the wrong time and being tortured to confess or to whatever. Who does the interrogations, the military, CIA, or private contractors?
Well, I think it's a mixture of interrogators, you know, as it has been at Guantanamo as well, of a large number of different agencies involved, depending on, you know, what particular agencies think their interest is in the prisoners.
Let me get to.
I mean, I was wondering, Riz, if I could
yeah,
just
please
go back to a point that my colleague made about the habeas corpus petitions in the Guantanamo cases, which I think is particularly important. I mean, he made some very good points, but about that he was claiming that when evidence had to be presented in a court, the way that information was gathered by people who were seized during wartime and the intelligence gathering that took place would mean that there was no way that it was possible for the government to prove its case.
Virtually
and I really
no
must
way.
take exception to well, I mean, I understand that in some cases it's difficult to establish some of the evidence, but I mean the case that we've recently seen, the latest ruling in the case of a Kuwaiti called Fuad al-Rabia, this man was essentially some of the unreliable witnesses in Guantanamo. And let's remember, most of the allegations are made by other prisoners. And there are a number of notoriously unreliable prisoners who've made unsubstantiated lies about other prisoners that have been investigated and found to be wrong. Alleged that this man, Fuad al-Rabia, had met Osama bin Laden and was a big man in the Tora Bora campaign. Well, what's turned out in this case when it was examined by a judge was that no such thing happened. That this man had been pressurized, you know, I would certainly use the word abuse, possibly the word torture, to make this man admit that he had done these things and to come up with a narrative of how he had met Osama bin Laden, how he had been a big man in Tora Bora, and all of it was a complete lie. So, you know, it's very, very important for me to establish that when habeas corpus petitions are taking place, these rulings that are going against the government are going against the government by and large because they can't come up with evidence because they haven't got any.
Well, actually,
we're seeing fabrications, lies, and mosaics of intelligence that don't stand up to any form of scrutiny.
Let's get a response.
You know, I just thought it was important to mention that.
Okay, I'll get a response from you, David. Also, there is this issue about the fact that there were incentives given to people to turn in potential, you know, threats and security threats and people who might be suspect. And there were many cases of people just handed over, you know, who really weren't worthy suspects.
I would say this. It would be foolhardy for me to try to debate facts of an individual case on television, and I frankly don't know as much perhaps of the case as Andrew does. But look, it's a fact. What process, what system you establish has operational consequences. Most serious critics would acknowledge, I think, that if you establish a full-bore habeas process, which is enormously deferential to the rights of the accused, developed in a civilian system where police officers, including, you know, SWAT teams, have no problem securing the apprehension site, getting over information, they don't have to worry that they'll be ambushed on the way out, the time on target is low, has huge disadvantages for the government, and it's virtually impossible. Let's pretend that some of these people maybe are not innocent shepherds. Let's pretend that they ought to be properly detained because they're enemy combatants. The government's ability to bring this result about in the context of a habeas process is dismally low because you cannot gather, because you suppress coercively obtained confessions, even if it's only coercive in atmosphere. You have no time to give a forensic evidence. How the heck are you supposed to be able to prevail in a habeas proceeding.
We'll try and get onto some of the issues that might address the concerns you've raised and Andy's raised as well in just a moment. We're going to take a very short break here. As